Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really zeroing in on, well, the absolute bedrock of how we move.
Mm-hmm.
Something essential, but, often overlooked. The human foot.
It really is remarkable when you stop and think about it.
It's just this incredibly complex bit of biological engineering, right? The
Mm.
foundation we stand on, the thing that moves us.
Absolutely. And there's so much packed into such a small space. You've got dozens of bones, joints, ligaments.
Dozens.
Yeah, and then complex networks of muscles too, some just inside the foot, the intrinsics, and others coming down from the leg, the extrinsics.
Right, it's easy to take them for granted until they start complaining.
Exactly.
And our mission today for this deep dive is really to use these sources you've shared, the articles, the research, your notes, to kind of get into the weeds.
Okay.
We want to understand the basics, the anatomy, the biomechanics, but also explore how feet naturally vary,
Yeah.
that wijami, or unique structure and function.
Mm-hmm. The individual differences.
Yeah, and then connect those variations to how they might affect the rest of the body, how forces travel up, maybe impacts on balance, even potentially confidence.
That's a great plan. The sources give us a really good map for exploring exactly those connections, foot structure, body mechanics, and potential consequences.
Okay, so let's unpack this foundation. Where do we start? What are the absolute core jobs the foot has, according to this research?
Well, at its most fundamental, especially during dynamic things like walking or running,
Yeah.
the foot really has three primary roles. First, it needs to be stable enough to support your entire body weight against gravity.
Okay, stability.
That makes sense. Second, it has to be able to absorb shock, the impact forces every time your foot strikes the ground.
Absorb, right, like a cushion.
Exactly. And finally, it needs to transform into a rigid lever to provide the push-off, the propulsion that moves you forward.
Got it. Support, absorb,
Those
propel.
are the key actions, yeah. The fundamentals.
It sounds simple like that, but with all those bones and joints you mentioned, how does that complexity actually allow it to do all that?
The structure is absolutely key. Those many joints aren't just extra parts. They allow for a really wide range of motions.
Like what kind of motions?
You've got gliding joints, hinge joints, and also multiplanar joints. Those allow movement in multiple directions at once.
Okay.
But what's really critical, and something the research highlights, is the interdependence between different parts of the foot, how they influence each other.
Interdependence, you mean like a chain reaction?
Precisely. There's this crucial biomechanical link, especially between the subtalar joint that's down in the rear foot near the heel
Uh-huh.
and the transverse tarsal joint, which is in the midfoot. When the subtalar joint pronates, that's the inward rolling motion.
Okay, I think I know that feeling.
Yeah.
Hey.
When that happens, it essentially unlocks the transverse tarsal joint, pulling it into pronation too. And this combined movement leads to a flattening of the main arch, the medial longitudinal arch.
So the whole foot becomes more flexible.
Exactly. It increases the overall flexibility.
So motion way back at the heel directly changes the arch and the middle part of the foot.
Yes, they're mechanically coupled. And the opposite happens too. When the subtalar joint supinates, rolls outward,
Right.
it tends to lock that transverse tarsal joint. This makes the arch rise up, and the whole foot acts more like a rigid structure.
Ah, okay. So flexible then rigid.
Precisely. And that ability to shift between being a flexible shock absorber during landing, with pronation, and then becoming a rigid lever for push-off with supination, that's fundamental for efficient walking and running.
That makes so much sense now. You need both states.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned variation earlier, that Yayuga Mae. People's feet aren't identical clones.
Mm.
How do researchers or doctors usually categorize these differences based on the sources?
Clinically, yeah, they often categorize feet based on static structure, particularly arch height and alignment when you're just standing still.
Okay.
The most common terms you'll see in the literature are planus, rectus, and cavus.
Which translate to?
Planus means a low or flattened arch, what most people call flat-footed. Rectus is considered the neutral or normal alignment, and cavus refers to a high or elevated arch.
Flat, normal, high. Got it. And do these shapes relate to how the foot is aligned overall?
They often do. For instance, planus, the flat arch, is frequently seen with what's called hindfoot valgus. That means the heel bone tends to lean inward relative to the leg.
Oh, wow.
Whereas cavus, the high arch, might be associated with hindfoot varus, where the heel leans a bit outward. Rectus is the middle ground.
Okay, so those are the static shapes we might see just looking at someone standing. But feet move.
Mm.
How do these structural types connect to dynamic movements like that pronation and supination we talked about during walking?
That's a really critical distinction. The static shape is just a snapshot, right?
Right.
How the foot moves during gait, that's the whole movie.
Good analogy.
And there's a strong link, the research suggests, between the static posture and how the foot tends to move dynamically.
So, planus feet.
Planus feet, because of their structure, often tend to exhibit excessive or maybe prolonged pronation during the stance phase of walking. They roll inward more or stay rolled in longer.
Okay. And high arches.
Cavus feet, being naturally more rigid, sometimes tend towards the other extreme excessive supination, or maybe just not enough pronation. They might maintain that outward tilt more.
So the structure kind of sets you up or predisposes you to a certain pattern of movement.
There's definitely that tendency, yes. The sources also touch on how these things are measured objectively,
Right, not just looking.
not just looking. Clinicians might use something like the Foot Posture Index, which involves observing specific landmarks and scoring them, but researchers are increasingly using more advanced tech,
Like what?
like AI analyzing photos, or even detailed 3D foot scanning, which gives you a huge amount of data about the foot shape, its morphology.
Wow, 3D scans.
Yeah. But it's worth noting, the sources mention some limitations. Some tools, maybe the AI ones particularly, might not be as accurate for everyone, like young children whose feet are still growing, or perhaps individuals with obesity where landmarks can be harder to see clearly.
That's important context. Okay, so we have structure, motion, ways to measure. Now, this is where I find it gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
How do these static differences, these Wujimi, actually translate into objective, measurable, functional differences? Do flat feet and high arched feet genuinely work differently when you measure something like, say, pressure?
Oh, absolutely. The research provides pretty clear objective evidence here.
Yeah.
One study looked at people without foot pain, comparing those with planus, rectus, and cavus feet. They found significant measurable differences in structural things like the arch height index.
Which is just how high the arch is relative to foot length.
Exactly. And also the malleolar valgus index, which gives you an idea of ankle alignment relative to the heel. So these categories aren't just visual judgments, they reflect real differences in geometry.
Okay, real geometric differences. And how does that different geometry change how the foot actually meets the ground? What about that pressure?
Right, the plantar pressure data is really telling. If you look at high arched, the cavus feet, the pressure tends to be very concentrated, usually under just two main spots,
Hmm.
the heel and the forefoot, like under the ball of the foot.
Wow.
And there's very little pressure across the middle part, the midfoot. It's almost like you're trying to walk just on the front and back edges.
Okay, so really focused pressure points. What about the flat-arched, the planus feet?
They show a much more spread out pattern. The pressure extends right into the midfoot area, even when carrying significant load.
Right.
The whole sole is basically making contact and sharing the weight.
So the load isn't as localized.
Exactly. It's distributed much more broadly across the entire contact surface.
That seems like it would fundamentally change how forces travel up your leg.
Yeah.
Does the path of pressure also change as you walk?
Yes, the path of the center of pressure, that's the point where the ground force effectively acts on the foot. That path also differs quite notably.
How so?
For planus feet, which tend towards that excessive pronation, the center of pressure track tends to move more medially towards the inside edge of the foot as you move through stance.
Okay.
And for cavus feet, it often tracks more laterally towards the outside edge. So this dynamic pressure path really mirrors that characteristic inward or outward rolling associated with the foot type.
It's really clear then, these structural variations have real, tangible effects on how the foot functions and interacts with the ground.
Right.
Was there anything unexpected in the sources regarding flexibility?
Yes, actually. One finding that kind of stood out from that study comparing the asymptomatic groups
Yeah.
was about arch flexibility. They measured how much the arch height changed between sitting, non-weight bearing, and standing weight bearing.
Okay, how much it squashes down?
Right. And interestingly, that measure did not differ significantly between the planus, rectus, and cavus groups.
Really? So flat feet weren't necessarily more flexible in that way.
Not according to that specific measure in that study, no. It suggests that while the static height is definitely different, the amount it changes under load, the flexibility, isn't necessarily dictated by these broad categories, at least in people without symptoms.
That does challenge the common idea that flat arches are always super flexible and high arches are always totally rigid.
It does. It points to more complexity.
Okay, so structure impacts static shape, pressure, and movement tendencies, but maybe not flexibility quite like we assume. This leads perfectly to the next big question. Are these variations, this Wayujama, linked to actual pain or injury risk, maybe elsewhere in the body?
This is definitely a major focus in the research, and the sources highlight quite a few reported associations. It's been suggested, for example, that specific foot types, planus or cavus, and also dynamic postures, like being overly pronated or supinated,
Ah,
are associated with a higher risk for certain running injuries, particularly things like stress injuries in the tibia, your shin bone, shin splints, for instance.
okay. What about specific problems in the foot, or even higher up the chain?
Well, low arches, the planus feet, have been linked in some studies to a higher chance of developing things in the forefoot, like hallux valgus, that's the bunion deformity.
Right.
Also, hammer toes, overlapping toes. And some research connects flat feet to more overuse injuries generally in the lower limb, and maybe more reports of ankle and even knee pain.
And the high arches, the cavus feet?
High arches are perhaps less linked to bunions, but they are associated with things like hammer toes and claw toe deformities, and they can also be linked to ankle pain.
Okay. And what about that excessive inward rolling, the pronation during movement? Any specific links there?
Yes, excessive pronation specifically comes up quite often.
Yeah.
It's been associated with medial tibial stress syndrome, again, shin splints, and also patellofemoral pain syndrome. That's pain around the kneecap.
Ah, runner's knee, sometimes people call it that.
Sometimes, yeah. And there are even some suggestions that the effect could travel further up the kinetic chain, potentially increasing the load on the hip joint if someone pronates significantly.
Wow, all the way up to the hip.
It's possible. The sources even mention a specific clinical link in patients with diabetes. Foot type seems correlated with where neuropathic ulcers tend to form.
House.
Ulcers tend to show up more on the medial side of the forefoot in planus feet and more on the lateral side in cavus feet.
So the foot's basic structure could influence where complications from another condition might appear. That's quite a connection.
The
But T
Yes. There's always a but in biomechanics, isn't there?
feels like it. So what's the nuance here?
The crucial nuance, which the sources are careful to stress, is that while we see all these associations reported,
Hmm.
the scientific evidence often struggles to definitively prove a clear one-way causal link. It's just a really complex system.
Meaning?
Meaning it's very hard to say for sure that the foot structure caused the knee pain, for example. It's entirely possible sometimes that an existing problem higher up, maybe a hip issue or muscle weakness, could actually change how you walk over time.
And that could lead to changes down in the foot, like the arch flattening?
Precisely. It becomes a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Which came first?
Right.
And adding to that complexity, some really large studies, particularly looking at runners prospectively over time, haven't found a significant link between things like static arch height or how much the heel tilts and the actual risk of developing running injuries.
So it's not always a straightforward connection.
Not always, no. It suggests the relationship is probably influenced by many other things. Your shoes, how you train, muscle strength all the way up the leg, your specific movement patterns. It's multifactorial. Research is definitely still trying to tease apart all these interactions.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is
Yeah.
and just how tricky it is to isolate one single cause for pain or injury in the body.
Okay, moving beyond just injury risk, how do these foot variations, especially when they become actual significant problems, impact someone's ability to just move around day to day? Yeah, the sources give us a really good insight here by looking at people who have symptomatic osteoarthritis in their foot joints. So this isn't just variation anymore, it's pathology, significant structural compromise.
Okay, what happens then?
Well, a study comparing these patients with foot OA to healthy people found really clear, measurable differences in how they walk, their gait mechanics.
What kinds of changes?
They saw reduced range of motion in really key foot joints like the main ankle joint, the tibiotalar joint, and also in the mid-tarsal joint complex, the parts you need for push-off.
Less movement.
Less movement. And also, the coordination between different segments of the foot was altered compared to the healthy group. The smooth coupling was disrupted.
Hmm.
And crucially, they measured a reduction in force and power generation during that push-off phase of walking.
Yeah.
For instance, things like the peak plantar flexion moment, the twisting force generated at the ankle to push off, and the velocity were lower.
So essentially less oomph coming from the foot when they take a step.
Exactly, less powerful push-off.
And how did that line up with what the patients themselves were actually experiencing?
It correlated directly. They used standard questionnaires like the Foot Function Index, and these patients consistently reported having significant difficulty with activities that really demand good foot mobility and power.
Like what?
Things like trying to walk fast, or standing up on their tiptoes, or even just walking for long distances. These were rated as much more difficult or painful for them.
So the objective measurements match their subjective feeling of limitation.
Yes, the biomechanical deficits really mirrored their reported functional disability.
Makes perfect sense. If the basic mechanics of pushing off are weaker or painful, anything requiring that is going to be tough. Did the researchers suggest why these gait patterns were so altered? Was it just the joint damage?
They suggested it likely wasn't just the physical damage to the joints. Other factors probably play a big role too,
Such as?
such as pain itself,
Huh?
or even the fear of pain, something called kinesiophobia. This could lead people to consciously or maybe unconsciously change how they walk to try and avoid discomfort.
Holding back, essentially.
Right. A more cautious way of accepting weight onto the foot, maybe landing more flat footed, could also contribute to that less dynamic, less powerful push off they observed.
So pain, and even the psychological response to pain, can literally change how you physically move. And thinking about that, if your feet aren't working well, if you feel less stable on that foundation, that must impact balance too, right?
Absolutely. The sources mention this that functional limitations in the foot can make it difficult for some patients even to complete standard clinical tests that involve prolonged walking or standing on one leg. Balance is definitely affected.
It really sounds like a potential negative cycle. The physical problem causes pain or fear, which changes movement, which might make the limitation worse or harder to overcome.
It can certainly become a challenging cycle, yes.
So given these potential problems stemming from foot structure and function, what kinds of solutions or interventions are being looked at in the research you shared?
Well, one of the sources is actually a protocol for a big review looking specifically at foot-based biomechanical interventions.
Okay, what did that include?
It covers things you might expect, like specific kinds of footwear, different types of insoles or orthotics, both custom made and off the shelf,
Hmm.
and even things like therapeutic taping methods or bracing techniques applied to the foot or ankle.
And the goal of using these things is?
The main aim, as described, is to directly influence or alter the foot's biomechanics while someone is moving, walking, running.
How?
For example, an orthotic might be designed specifically to try and reduce excessive rear foot pronation, that inward roll. The idea is that by controlling or guiding the foot's motion,
Right.
you might be able to tap into those kinetic chain links, those coupling mechanisms we talked about earlier.
Ah, so changing the foot's movement might change things higher up.
That's the theory. By optimizing or altering motion at the foot, the hope is to potentially influence the forces and loads experienced by joints higher up the leg, like the knee. Maybe reducing stress on the patellofemoral joint, for instance, which could help with kneecap pain.
So it's really about trying to influence the whole chain by starting right down at the foundation, tweaking or supporting the foot's motion to hopefully get a positive ripple effect upwards.
Precisely. It's a very active area of research. How can we use these external tools to beneficially adjust the body's internal mechanics?
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big picture from this deep dive into your sources? It seems overwhelmingly clear just how fundamental and how incredibly complex the foot actually is.
It really is. This intricate structure, all those bones, joints, tissues, it's our primary interface with the world beneath us, supporting us, absorbing impact, propelling us.
And we've seen that this foundation isn't uniform. It varies significantly from person to person, that UMI, those structural and functional differences.
Yeah.
And these aren't just slight variations, they lead to real measurable differences in pressure distribution and dynamic movement.
Exactly. How we load the ground and move across it differs based on our foot structure.
We also looked at those reported links associations between certain foot types or movement patterns and various issues, from things like bunions and ankle pain, right up to potential effects on the knee and even the hip.
But, and it's a crucial but, the sources consistently remind us that correlation isn't causation.
Right, the links are reported, but proving the foot caused the problem is often complex. Sometimes the influence might even go the other way.
Yes, the scientific picture is definitely nuanced and still evolving.
Absolutely. And we saw some really compelling evidence, especially from the osteoarthritis research, showing that when foot problems become significant, they don't just cause local pain, they demonstrably change our gait mechanics.
Making essential daily activities really challenging.
Yeah. And importantly, it seems it's not just about the physical damage itself, but also about how pain, and even the fear of pain, can actively change how we move, potentially affecting balance and stability.
That psychological component, the kinesiophobia, seems quite impactful. The effects really do ripple outwards.
So thinking about that final point, if physical limitations in your feet or just the worry about pain when you move can restrict what you feel able or willing to do. If it makes simple things like walking confidently feel difficult, maybe impacting your balance, your stability, how might that physical experience, that feeling of having a less reliable foundation, extend beyond just the physical? How could that ripple outwards, perhaps subtly, maybe not so subtly, and affect your overall confidence in just navigating the world around you? Something to reflect on.